I would like to introduce Susanna Laurin. Susanna is the chair of the Funka Foundation and an expert when it comes to EEA regulations. She is eager to be involved in research, innovation, policy, standards, as well as lend a practical hand in order to make a difference and make the world of technology much more accessible. 2025 is going to make history, and Susanna is here to explain how to prepare your business for the European Accessibility Act, which is coming into force in the summer of 2025. I'm very excited to hear from her, and I know a lot of businesses are very much bracing for this. Hello, Susanna. Thank you for joining us today on QualityForge.
Hello, and thanks for having me. I hope everything works with the slideshow and sound and all of that.
Yes, our tech
guy is giving us a thumbs up.
Sounds good.
The stage is yours.
The stage is yours. You take it away.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I don't know where people are, if you are in the room somewhere or online, but welcome to this little quick walkthrough of the Accessibility Act. I will not be able to go through everything in this legislation, of course, because it's a very limited time, but I hope to give you at least some highlights and tips on the way. So my name is Susanna Laurin, and as was said, I'm the managing director of a small independent research institution based out of Sweden, currently in Brussels, but that's for another reason. I'm also representing the International Association of Accessibility Professionals towards the EU, and I'm currently also the chair of the joint technical body e-accessibility for the standardization organizations that work on making sure that we have standards to go with the Accessibility Act. So most of what is happening right now is kind of my fault, or if you want somebody to blame, at least you can look in my direction. So what I'm trying to do in this short period of time is to talk a little bit about the legislation, mention something about the standards that are important to know about, and then give a little bit of recommendations for preparation if you haven't already started your journey towards the next legislation updates next summer. So I think it's important to understand that the EAA is not a regulation, it's a directive. There are different levels of legislation in the EU, and a regulation applies across all member states. It's the same, it's a one-size-fits-all, it goes across the member states, and everyone does exactly the same thing. GDPR is a regulation, most people know about that. All the EU legislation on accessibility are directives, and that means that we have a common an overview of what is the common purpose of the law and who is covered and what is covered and so on, but all of that is transposed or implemented into national legislation. Some people say that makes it weaker than a regulation. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it makes sense to do accessibility legislation as directives because the countries, the member states, are at very different maturity levels when it comes to digitalization in the broader sense, and also when it comes to accessibility. There are also differences in culture and history and how you treat these things, and assistive technology provisions and all of that. So in my head, it does really make sense that the accessibility legislation is transposed nationally. Of course, that makes it flexible and good, but also slightly less harmonized than a regulation would. So there are pros and cons of both of these, but it's important to know the difference. At member state level, the countries can either update existing legislation or develop new laws in order to make sure that they meet the new legislation. Every member state also is required to have a surveillance authority when it comes to the European Accessibility Act. And in most countries, these will be sector-based. So if you already have a surveillance authority for the bank and financial system, and you have one for IT or things like that, then they will most probably, in most countries, have the surveillance responsibility for the Accessibility Act sector-based. Some of the smaller member states may have just one surveillance authority, but so it differs depending on the member state. Also, the penalties are decided at national level. So that means that we have different the enforcement procedures are the same in all countries, but they may difference in how big the fines will be, and also whether there is a possible prison sentence at the end of the road or not. Of course, harmonization is the goal. It's the goal of the legislator, and I believe also most of the member states realize that harmonization is a good thing and that it really supports the inner market and all the cross-border sales of goods and services, and also accessibility testing tools and so on. So it's not like the member states are trying to be difficult and therefore they change things, but sometimes there are good reasons for doing things slightly different in some member states. However, looking at the implementation of the Accessibility Act, the differences are quite small when it comes to scope and requirements. So just a little bit of repetition maybe for some of you about the scope of the Accessibility Act. It's manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, distributors, and providers of certain products and services. Sometimes we hear that this is a legislation for private sector. That's not exactly true, because this act doesn't matter what kind of organization is behind, as long as you're part of this, an economic operator as part of this ecosystem, all the way from manufacturing to providing the service to product or service to clients or to customers. So this means that it's also a very broad and ambitious legislation, because even if an economic operator is headquartered outside of the EU but want to sell their product or service in the inner market of the European Union, they still need to comply with this legislation. So quite a wide spread ambition for this legislation. When we look more specifically at the products and services in scope of the legislation, the products first are computers, smartphones, tablets, all of that, including their operating systems. We have payment terminals and self-service terminals, electronic terminals for communication, everything around digital TV and e-readers. And if we look at the services in scope, that covers electronic communication services, streaming services, and when it comes to transportation, the digital services of that, so not the buses and trains in themselves, but everything around ticket machines and digital information and so on. That is all the digital services around the transportation system. We have ebooks and software, e-commerce, and e-commerce in a very broad sense, and consumer banking services. So this is already quite wide scope, of course, but it doesn't cover everything. You need to be within those products and services mentioned in the legislation to be in scope of this legislation. And then we come to the requirements. So where do I understand what to do from my perspective if I'm now an economic operator somewhere in this ecosystem? Well, in the European legislation, in the European Accessibility Act, it's very clearly defined who is in scope of the legislation and what is in scope of the legislation. So that is really found in the legislation. Also, it says what accessibility means in different products and services. And then we have the European standards. And those standards are voluntary documents aiming to support you if you are a product owner or a service provider. So to meet the requirements. So that is kind of the how to meet the requirements. That is published in the standards. But, and this is important, you don't have to follow the standard. The standards are created as presumed conformance. So if you do meet the standards, then you know that it's very likely that you have also met the legislation. But if you prefer to meet the accessibility requirements of the legislation in another way, you are absolutely welcome to do it. Then you have the burden of proof yourself, of course, but this way we also leave room for innovation. So the standard is there to help, but it's not part of the legislation. That's also important to remember the difference between those two things. The EN 301549 is the kind of the key standard when it comes to digital accessibility in Europe. It has been around for a while. It started to be This first version was to support the procurement directive, and then the next update was to support the web accessibility directive. And now we are updating it and reviewing it again in order for it to support the European Accessibility Act. So this is kind of a baby that many of us have been working on for a long time. And it's also a standard that has made a good kind of a journey out to the world is now implemented in many countries outside of the EU as well. And it's a very broad standard. So when a new legislation enters into force, the European Commission is providing a mandate or a standardization request to the standardization organizations in Europe. So, and the current mandate is called 587, is covering many things. So the standardization organizations are required to update existing standards. So first of all, the EN 301, 549 on products and services. And then also the EN 17161, that is a standard, more a procedural standard, supporting you with the methodology on how to use a design for all approach to achieve accessibility. We are also updating the EN 17210, which is a standard on the built environment. And of course, some of you will think, why are we updating a standard on accessibility in the built environment when this is a legislation that has to do with digital things? But in the European Accessibility Act, there is an opt-in, opt-out possibility for member states that also would like to make sure that the built environment, the accessibility of the built environment is also included. So there is a voluntary possibility for member states to also use this legislation when it comes to accessibility of the built environment. And therefore, we're also updating this standard. Apart from those three updates, we are also creating or developing new standards. So the first standard is on non-digital content. And the second one is for accessibility of support services. And then maybe the most important one, at least for me personally, I think, is the accessibility of emergency services, which is still something that, I mean, really about life and death today for people with disabilities. So 3 existing standards being updated and 3 new standards are being developed. And this, of course, takes time. And unfortunately, it will not be finished before the Accessibility Act enters into force. So people think, oh, then we can't do anything because there is no standard in place. Then remember, the standards are a voluntary support measure, and you still have to comply with the legislation, even if the standard is not in place. And there are already well-written requirements. The current version of the EN 301549 is out there, and there will be publicly available drafts that would support you if you would like to look at them even before they are stable, of course. But it is an issue that the standards and the legislation are not entering into force at the same date. But that is unfortunately the situation right now. On a kind of an overall approach to the requirements, you can say that they cover the specific product or service that you are in charge of. So there are general requirements in the Act, and then there are product-specific and service-specific, and then you can even have certain requirements for like self-service terminals specifically, or for e-commerce, or for banks, and so on. So there are kind of 3 layers of requirements in the Act itself. But in general, the product or service needs to be accessible. And then the information and instruction around the product or service also needs to be accessible. Any support services to go with a product or service needs to be accessible, as well as the packaging, if we're talking about a product. And of course, you need to provide documentation around the accessibility so that the surveillance authority and also others buying your product or service and making decisions around it know in what way it fulfills the requirements. So it's also quite all-encompassing, you can say, when it comes to the requirements. So how to do this? How do you go about making sure that you meet the requirements and are prepared on the 28th of June next year when the Accessibility Act enters into force? Well, my recommendation will always be to take one step at a time. And I hope that everyone listening here are not kind of haven't started at all yet. So probably you are already one step ahead, or at least not on kind of square 1 or 0. But just as a first step, I think is always to make some kind of analysis. So look down and say, what is the current state? Where are we right now with our product or service? How accessible are we? Do we know that at all? Do we understand where we are, or if there is a gap already to fill? And then when you understand your current status of accessibility, you start looking for the internal resources and say, so if everything is perfect, then that's good. But usually you do find a couple of things that are not already accessible when you start looking at it. And then you need to understand what kind of internal resources do we have? Do we have the competence, the experience, the processes in place? Or do we need to update that? Do we need to train our staff? Or do we need to maybe look at external experts to help us do that? Do we have a testing procedure? Do we have end users to test with? How do we do this? And that is really important to map and get an idea of, so that you can move on and make sure that you have a good process internally, to not be kind of woken up all one day and with somebody saying, hey, you're not accessible, and you really have no idea. So that kind of analysis and looking kind of inwards in the beginning, I think is a really, really important step, because if you don't know where you are, there is no way you can draw a map and end up in a good place. So after this analysis, and you know your situation and the status, then it's usually a question about competence. So very often that requires some kind of training or competence sharing, if you will. It could be interesting to look at certification. So IAAP does have accessibility certification. There are other ways of doing some kind of guarantee in accessibility, but it's important to kind of document where you are and how you make sure that the competence is really in-house already. And also, I think it's very important in most cases to have buy-in from management, because this will require resources, maybe even budget if you rely on external suppliers and so on. And it's really important that this is not just one accessibility ambassador that tries to push this through, but that it's the whole team or the whole group, and also really that the management and leading people understand how important that is, and provides the time and resources to fix the accessibility issues. And then working with the procedures. And this is something that is often lacking, and something that we try to recommend again and again. And sometimes we feel that accessibility is really seen as a one-off. You do one thing, one project or one activity, and then you kind of forget it. And I've never seen an organization succeed with accessibility doing it that way. So I think it's extremely important to build in procedures and methods, workflows to be able to succeed with accessibility. Really to have a way of working. We know that before this and this happens, we do this testing, or we go to this team, or we have this number of weeks to do internal testing, or whatever it is. It depends, of course, of the product or service and how large the organization is and all of that. But somehow you need to have a way to make sure that before launch, you know that the product or service is accessible, or you know that you have a problem, but at least that you're aware of the level of accessibility, and hopefully you take it seriously so that you will not launch if it's not meeting the requirements. And here it's also important to document your workflow, so that when this very ambitious person who is now driving the accessibility team goes on maternity leave or something, that you're not left alone. You need to document how this process works and this workflow, so that anyone can make sure to do it. Because accessibility is not one person's responsibility or even one team. I mean, it's everyone needs to work on accessibility and understand at least the basics of it. And here I think it's also important to think about, how do we work with standards? Do we use the standards as inspiration? Do we use it as the requirement? Do we meet the standards always, or have we kind of interpreted the standards our own way? There are many different ways of working with standards, but try to have some kind of connection to the standards, or base your work on standards. That will for sure help you in the beginning to make sure that you meet the requirements of the legislation. And the EN 301549 is a standard that is published free of charge. So you don't need to pay for this knowledge that you get from the standard. So I want to end up on a positive note. I think one of the most beautiful things in the Accessibility Act is where it talks about maximizing the foreseeable use. That's really a way of explaining what accessibility is and how I think accessibility can be perceived. So not as, oh no, this is another regulation or this is another rule, somebody's imposing this on us and oh, boring standards, this is horrible. But no, this is the whole idea, is to make sure that your product and service can be used by as many users as possible. That's a positive thing and should also be a good investment to make sure that your business makes sense for as many users as possible. So maximizing the foreseeable use, I think, is a good kind of leading payoff for starting accessibility work to meet the requirements for June 2025. So I hope I have some time for questions, if we have any questions from the audience.
We do have some time for some questions. First of all, thank you. We're aware summarizing an entire European Act into something so succinct is no easy task, so we appreciate how well you did that and picked out those key points.
Yeah, I actually really loved the kind of step-by-step timeline which you did that included the analysis part, competence and procedures, because it's really easy to get lost for businesses in all of this process, basically.
Yes, but we do have some questions, just sort of, I guess, add some extra points. The first one is, have you noticed that companies are now starting to actively work on their accessibility because of the upcoming regulations, and how are you kind of seeing that come about amongst them?
Yes, I usually refer to what was happening 1 year before the Web Accessibility Directive entered into force, which covers the public sector, because I was heavily involved in that work as well. And during the transposition period, many of us worked on that directive, and we thought that everyone knew what we were talking about. But really, when that entered into or got adopted in the member states, the public sector bodies, most of them kind of woke up and said, oh, why didn't anyone tell us about this? And we were very, very surprised. But now, more than 1 or 2 years ago, I am doing almost nothing else than training and providing support services and so on the Accessibility Act. So I feel that the private sector, commercial companies are doing much more and are much more prepared and aware about this than the public sector ever was. And that makes me think that we are in a good place, in a good position. And I really see many of the companies doing a lot of work and really starting to process this. That said, this is mainly larger companies, and I know there are smaller companies that for sure struggle with this and probably don't even know about the legislation. So I don't have scientific proof of this on each sector in all of the countries, but we do see a lot of movement, and also a lot of movement in the market when it comes to accessibility services and the requirement for the not the requirement, the demand for training and not just for us, but generally in the market. I think there is a boom in demand for expertise, which is a good thing.
That's incredibly positive. That's very positive news.
Yeah, so basically we can really hope that companies are that one step ahead of this process.
Yeah, I hope so, and probably the larger one will kind of drag the smaller ones with them. That's what I hope, at least. So yeah.
Us too. Okay, moving on to the next question. What do you think were the driving factors that finally pushed the EU to adopt EAA, and why now?
I have to be careful with what I say and what I don't say, but I mean, there is the EU is based on the European Union has ratified the UN CRPD, and that is the baseline for all strategies and activities around the disabilities in the Union. And despite we had 15 years ago, there was a drawback on possible legislation, but since 2017, we got the update of the procurement directive that had kind of increased the requirements on accessibility. Then we had the Web Accessibility Directive, and now we have the Accessibility Act. It has been a kind of a gradual move towards more accessibility, and it's part of the disability strategy, and it has been planned for a long time, and then gradually kind of grown into it. So I think it has been it takes time. Things take time in the union, but when it starts to move, then it's kind of more or less unstoppable. So it's a good thing when it starts rolling. And really the key solution was when it stopped being the kind of the communication around the whole thing, the kind of internal negotiation process moved from being more of a social inclusion disability issue, but more of an inner market idea. So both the Web Accessibility Directive and the Accessibility Act are presented kind of in the legal framework as good for business. We are removing barriers so that technology companies can sell across borders. So both of these directives are actually inner market focused directives. That's not how you usually think about it, but I think that was kind of the turning point or the tipping point when it started to get traction within the trilogue.
Okay. We are seeing a bunch of questions coming through in the live chat, so I'm going to try succinctly summarize some of them. And they tend to go along the line of who is legally binded to comply in the case of software products? Is it the owner, the software vendor, or both?
Could be both. It really depends. Sorry for being political responding, but that will be a legally interesting detail to figure out. But I mean, it depends on if you are the distributor, the producer, and so on. And it can differ depending on the product or service. But I would say generally both at least needs to make sure that they comply.
Would you say there's different expectations for the vendor versus the owner? Are they going to walk in sort of a similar fashion?
I think the vendor is usually more aware and more keen, I would say. At least that's my experience, but I couldn't, I mean, I don't have any scientific proof or statistic proof of that, but that's my impression.
No, I think that's a good answer. Yeah. We had a bunch of those coming through, so I tried to put them into one question. I guess this is a shorter one here. Do you think legislation like the EA will lead to the Brussels effect globally, where we see what happens in Europe will lead to a larger impact globally?
I love that question. Thank you. Yes. The response is yes. I think so. I'm like a dinosaur in this. I've been doing this for so long, and the US has always been kind of the leader in accessibility because of their legislation and also being kind of bold in many ways, and also having many of the large tech companies, obviously. But nowadays, actually, we are the front runners here. We have the kind of the yellow T-shirt of Tour de France or whatever. I mean, our standards are imposing greater requirements on accessibility than the US ones do, and also the legislation is far more ambitious. So I think already we see that there is, I don't know if it's a Brussels thing, but an EU lead in this, and I really hope we can continue with that. And it's not kind of we need to compete with somebody, but it's just good that someone else can show that we can lead, and we do things a little differently. And I'm sure then, I mean, Canada is doing a fantastic job as well, so then they can take a lead on something, and then maybe Australia comes and so on. And if we continue to kind of compete a little bit but friendly, and then be really focusing on being good at different parts of this, I think that leads to kind of a jointly improvement of the accessibility profession and also the inclusiveness of society at large.
Wonderful. We have one last question.
Susanna, this may be a bit personal, but what keeps you motivated to keep pushing and advocating for digital accessibility? I mean, you have already put in such a huge work in this. What keeps you driving? That what I do makes a difference for individuals with disabilities every day. I don't know what else I could do that is as rewarding as doing accessibility. I just can't figure out another job that I would rather have. I mean, we all work a lot, but I think this is a fantastic community with super engaged people, and I
I mean, I learn something new every day, and I can go to bed happily asleep knowing that I've done things a little bit better for people with disabilities. I mean, that's a reward. I don't know what else I could do that would be that rewarding.
Very inspirational response there.
Yeah.
But I believe, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for both questions and presentation. Thank you again for being part of QualityForge. You did a great job succinctly summarising an entire European Act, and with our questions as well. It's been a pleasure to have you here today, and we hope to see you again.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.